So good morning, everyone, and thank you for registering for Gateways to the New World. Not all came through Ellis Island. I'm Kate Kisselstein, the junior librarian in Central Library's Local History and Genealogy Department. I'll give you a brief overview of dates relating to immigration at 7 major U.S. ports of immigration, then discuss some general information on passenger lists, and highlight using a key resource by taking you through a sample search for records. Rest assured, there will be time for questions at the end. So while some history sources only count 5 major ports of entry for immigration in the United States, according to an article from Ancestry, there were 7: Baltimore, Maryland; Boston, Massachusetts; Galveston, Texas; New Orleans, Louisiana; New York City, of course; Philadelphia, Pennsylvania; and San Francisco, California. There were, of course, many, many more minor ports, roughly 96, but these 7 saw the most immigration traffic from the 18th to 20th centuries. We start off simply by virtue of being first in the alphabet of the ports. We start off with Baltimore, Maryland, which welcomed its first immigrants in 1634 with the arrival of English and Irish settlers who sailed on the ships the Ark and the Dove. It also was on the slave trade route, as a great number of African slaves were brought to work in tobacco fields. By the mid-1700s, they represented roughly 1/4 the population of Maryland. And during the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, the U.S. government needed naval power and turned to the private sector, causing the port of Baltimore to become a bustling port for privateers. But by 1818, a thriving transportation network begins taking shape in the form of the National or Cumberland Road, which links Cumberland, Maryland to Wheeling, Virginia, which is now Wheeling, West Virginia. This network is further augmented in the late 1820s when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad begins serving passengers, leading many immigrants to use the Port of Baltimore as an entry point to the U.S. interior. Among those immigrants are the Irish fleeing the Great Famine and Germans escaping economic hardship and political unrest. They are followed by immigrants from other countries, but in smaller numbers. In 1867, there is a significant jump in numbers due to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Agreement with the North German Lloyd steamship that allows immigrants to purchase one ticket that covered sailing to Baltimore and then inland by train. One particular port that was part of this agreement was Bremerhaven, Germany. The following year, the B&O Railroad opens piers at Locust Point, which allows immigrants to go directly to the trains for the next leg of their journey to the inland United States. Baltimore continues to be a popular port, peaking at about 40,000 immigrants per year until World War I stops the flow, but not until almost 2 million immigrants pass through the port. While Massachusetts most notably welcomed its first European immigrants on the 21st of November, 1620, with the arrival of the Mayflower, the port of Boston wasn't established until 1630. It quickly became the leading trade and passenger port for the colony until eclipsed by the ports of Philadelphia and New York City in the 1750s. The port is shut down completely on March 31st, 1774, by Great Britain in response to the Boston Tea Party, and it remains closed until the East India Tea Company is repaid for its lost cargo. During the American Revolution, though, the port plays a strategic role in battles against the British troops, and again during the War of 1812. From 1820 to 1880, the port sees its first real wave of immigration due to the Industrial Revolution, with most coming from Ireland, especially during the period of the Great Famine. To help process those immigrants, a customs house is built on Long Wharf, but only those immigrants who needed to be detained due to paperwork or further examination were held at the station. Others were processed directly on the docks. By 1850, over 3/4 of the foreign-born residents of Boston were Irish. The industrial boom causes a second large wave of immigrants, adding people from Russia, Italy, China, Portugal, and other countries. The most notable group are Jewish immigrants fleeing pogroms. These immigrants, for the most part, settle in Boston and the surrounding towns, working in the factories, establishing neighborhoods and businesses. For examples, the Italians settle in the north end of Boston, which still has a predominantly Italian population today, much like the Irish in South Boston. As per Boston College's Eras of Migration project, record levels of immigration in the earliest 20th century spark a rising backlash against immigrants in the years before World War I. In 1817, the Boston-based Immigration Restriction League successfully lobbied Congress for federal legislation to curb immigration. Congress required a literacy test for immigrants and created an Asiatic barred zone, effectively barring all immigration from Asia. Even broader restrictions were enacted under the National Origins Act of 1924, which dramatically cut immigration levels through a new discriminatory quota system. Basing per-country quotas on the ancestry makeup of the U.S. population, the new system favored older immigrant groups from England, Ireland, and Germany, while tightly restricting visas for newer groups from Southern and Eastern Europe. Together, these new measures reduced the number of immigrants entering the country from more than 800,000 in 1921 to less than 150,000 by the end of the decade. In Boston, the foreign-born share of the city's population shrank from 30% in 1930 to only 13% in 1970. Galveston, Texas, appears as a port a little later in the early 19th century. It is initially established in 1816 by Mexican governor Louis Michel Ory as a defensive port and becomes a customs entry port for Mexico in 1825. In 1836, when the Republic of Texas is established, it welcomes groups of Swedish, Norwegian, and German immigrants, many of whom settle in Texas and the Southwest. Starting in 1845, when Texas is annexed by the United States, all the way until 1924, hundreds of thousands of immigrants arrive at the port of Galveston. So many arrive that the U.S. establishes the area's first immigration station there. On September 8, 1900, the most devastating hurricane in U.S. history, a Category 4, hit the island of Galveston, killing between 6,000 and 8,000 people. While the port itself survived, a 15-foot storm surge flooded the city and numerous homes and buildings were destroyed. So unless the record or a duplicate copy or other item that recorded the same data was moved to an inland area prior to that date, it is likely the record was destroyed in the hurricane. But you should check in nearby counties for any such replications of any records from the Galveston area prior to 1900, such as neighboring counties, regional offices of churches, and other similar repositories. Galveston County courthouse records were spared from the destruction, however, as they were kept in a vault that did survive. In response to the hurricane, city leaders dredged the ship channel to raise the island's grade. As a result, the port was now considered a deep water port and was able to handle larger ships. This led to Galveston being chosen over New Orleans as the location for a major new federal immigration station in 1906. From 1907 to 1914, thousands of Russian Jews were encouraged to immigrate to Texas over fears that too great an influx of the northern Atlantic ports would lead to a rise in anti-Semitism. The port experienced a lesser decline in immigration than some others during World War I, but ultimately immigration numbers dwindled after 1924. The other port in the South is the one at the city of New Orleans, which is founded in 1718 and used by both the French and the Spanish to allow better access to the interior of North America by sailing up the Mississippi River and along its tributaries. This makes it a particularly attractive port of entry for early immigrants to the U.S. when the U.S. acquires the port through the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, as it is the best and easiest access to what was then the western frontier of the young country. During the initial years, the Port of New Orleans is less regulated and more lax in following immigration law than other ports, a fact that some use to their benefit. Despite this laissez-faire attitude, the National Archives has passenger records for the Port of New Orleans dating back to 1813, a full 7 years before U.S. required ports to retain passenger lists. From 1820 until roughly 1860, the port welcomes over 550,000 immigrants seeking a better life. Most notably in 1837, so many arrived that New Orleans is the second leading port of entry in the U.S., second only to New York City. In addition, from 1847 to 1857, the port draws more immigrants than the next three leading ports of Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Immigration is practically halted, however, during the American Civil War due to the Union blockade of Confederate ports. While immigration does pick up again after the war, it never regains its pre-Civil War levels. In the 1880s, there are immigrants from Eastern Europe, a number of Italians, mostly from Sicily, and other Mediterranean immigrants. The last notable groups of immigrants that sailed into the port of New Orleans were Spanish and Latin American immigrants coming from nearby Cuba and the Caribbean. And New York City's port has a long history, which starts long before Ellis Island is built. While the first Europeans begin arriving in the early 1500s, it is not until the 1630s that immigrants will settle in the area that will become New York City. The majority of these initial immigrants are from Northern and Western European background, most notably the Dutch. They will retain control of the area called then New Amsterdam until 1664, when it will fall to the British. In 1674, a charter is granted to James, the Duke of York, which gives the area its name, New York. Nevertheless, Dutch immigrants will remain the largest group through the 1790s, followed closely in number by French Huguenots seeking religious freedom. By 1800, over 60,000 people reside in New York. From 1815 to 1880, which becomes known as the Old Immigration Era, the port sees immigrants from additional countries. Hundreds of thousands of Irish and German immigrants moved to the city, followed by the English and Scots. By 1860s, New York City had 813,669 residents, out of which 383,717 were foreign-born, including the majority of them being Irish and German. To assist in processing this influx of passengers, the Board of Commissioners of Immigration established an immigrant landing depot at the old Fort Clinton, naming it Castle Garden. This facility remains in use until 1890, when the facility proves to be inadequate for processing the ever-increasing number of immigrant arrivals. Part of this is due to the shift from Northern and Western European to Southern and Eastern European immigrants, which consisted mainly of Italians, Russian Jews, Poles, and Greeks. With the closure of Castle Garden, a temporary processing center was needed, which led to the use of the old barge office. Initially only used for 1 year until the opening of Ellis Island on January 1st, 1892, the barge office was again called into service after the original 3-story wooden structure at Ellis Island was destroyed by fire on June 15, 1897. Fortunately, none of the passenger records were lost in that fire. Congress immediately appropriated funds afterwards to replace the structures on Ellis Island with fireproof buildings. The new brick and ironwork structures of Ellis Island began welcoming immigrants again on the 17th of December, 1900. Shortly after the adoption of the Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, which imposed quotas on the number of immigrants allowed from any one country, traffic through Ellis Island reduced to a trickle. Further restrictions go into effect in 1929, with a mere 150,000 immigrants per year allowed entry to the U.S. These restrictions deal a virtual death blow to the importance of Ellis Island, and in later years, a portion of the island is used as a Coast Guard station and even a detention center for enemy aliens. Ellis Island welcomes its last immigrant in November 1954 and is then declared surplus property. Due to Pennsylvania's early policy of religious tolerance in 1682, Dutch and German immigrants arrive, establishing the first settlement of non-British Europeans in any English colony with the founding of Germantown in 1683. This is also significant for the fact that they stayed in the area, as most immigrants of the time would head further inland. From the 1690s to the early 1770s, large numbers of settlers arrived from England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, German-speaking lands, France, Holland, Spain, Sweden, and the Caribbean, as well as enslaved Africans, almost all seeking religious freedom. By 1775, so many have settled in Philadelphia that it is the largest city of colonial America, with over 32,000 people. By contrast, the next two largest cities, New York and Boston, have populations of only 25,000 and 16,000 respectively. Owing to events of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, Philadelphia experiences a decline in immigration. Nevertheless, a quarantine station known as the Lazaretto is built in 1799, located approximately 8 miles south of the city. By 1816, however, there is an increase in industrialization that draws an influx of immigrants from Northern Europe, most notably Ireland, Germany, and Britain. The Lazaretto will remain the principal station for receiving immigrants until 1893. The American Civil War years see immigration to Philadelphia decline once again, but it soon rebounds due to its various industries and continued religious tolerance. While immigrants still arrive from Northern and Western Europe, new waves of settlers arrive from Southern Europe, China, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And again, with the 1924 restrictive federal reforms, that causes a downturn in immigration to Philadelphia as well. Now we come to San Francisco, California, which has a station that is sometimes known as the Ellis Island of the West. San Francisco was first founded on the 29th of June, 1776 by colonists from Spain, but it doesn't experience a large increase in immigration until the gold rush of 1849. This brings in immigrants from France, Ireland, Mexico, Peru, Chile, as well as Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii. Those sailing from Europe endure up to a 5-month voyage around Cape Horn in South America. By 1852, newly established trans-Pacific trade routes bring in a significant influx of immigrants from China, most of whom are fleeing economic hardships in the Canton region. However, anti-Asian discrimination forces many of them to seek economic opportunities in service to white miners rather than be in direct competition with them. By the end of the gold rush in 1855, although some immigrants return home, a significant portion settle in the area. So much so that by 1880, 60% of the population of San Francisco is of immigrant stock, that is both foreign-born and first-generation Americans, with Chinese comprising 10% of the population of the city. Anti-Chinese sentiment reaches a fever pitch by 1882, when the U.S. Congress passes several new immigration laws. The first of these is the Chinese Exclusion Act, which bans skilled and unskilled laborers and Chinese employed in mining for a period of 10 years. Certain diplomatic officers are allowed, provided they have certification from the Chinese government, but even they run into issues which prevents their immigration. Following the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese settlers replaced Chinese as California's most numerous Asian immigrant group. filling employers' demands for cheap, non-white labor. However, by the time of the 1906 earthquake, Japanese immigrants find themselves the target of anti-Asian discrimination. In order to continue enforcing the Chinese Exclusion Act, an immigration station is built on Angel Island, which opens its doors on the 21st of January, 1910. Over the course of its 30 years of operation, this Ellis Island of the West processes over 1 million immigrants. This includes 175,000 Chinese and 150,000 Japanese immigrants, many of whom are detained for weeks or even months in terrible conditions. Angel Island Immigration Station closed on the 5th of November, 1940, after a fire destroyed the administration building and women's quarters. Immigration was ultimately halted by the U.S. entering World War II on the 8th of December, 1941. Now I'd like to take you through the types of passenger records. And I realize some of you may be familiar with this information from my last talk, but I feel I'd be remiss if I didn't at least provide this overview. The first type of records you may come across are called cargo manifest passenger lists, and these are ones that date from before 1820. These records are not preserved by the National Archives, with few exceptions. One of those being the records from New Orleans, starting in 1813. The next type of passenger lists are customs passenger lists, and these were required after U.S. passed the Steerage Act of 1819. The Steerage Act of 1819. And this required the ship's captains to provide a manifest of passengers boarded at foreign ports, and also required each vessel to carry specific quantity of provisions for each passenger, with an entitlement to compensation should supplies prove deficient. The information included on these lists is the basic information such as name, date of arrival, age, and nationality, but also needs to include the point of departure, gender, and occupation. The last type of passenger list we run into are immigration passenger lists, and these are the ones that would be ideal, and they start in 1891 with the passage of the Immigration Act. And further documentation is required so that the information collected about immigrants is collected about immigrants as well as those coming overland from Canada and Mexico. It is interesting to note that approximately 40% of the foreign passengers arriving in Canada were actually bound for the United States. So the border crossing records begin capturing a large pool of immigrants that likely would not have shown up before 1891. And the other point for this act is that it also created a superintendent of immigration who oversaw the immigration inspectors at ports of entry. In addition, it barred polygamists, persons convicted of crimes of moral turpitude, and those suffering from diseases, which created the provision for medical examinations. Passenger arrival and departure records dated after 1957 were filmed by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the original paper records were not retained. As of 2023, the Ascensioned microfilm reels, now in the custody of the National Archives in Washington, are the record copies of the original paper records, which no longer exist. Unfortunately, due to the fragile nature of the original camera negative film, access to the microfilm is limited until it can be transferred to a more suitable format. The National Archives is in the process of transferring the microfilm to a digital format, and digitized copies will eventually be available online via the National Archives catalog. And that is something that is ongoing. So there are definitely places that you can look online, but there's also places you can look offline for your immigrant ancestor. And while there are several sources for researching passenger lists, one of the most comprehensive resources is Passenger and Immigration List Index 1500s to 1900s by P. William Philby. It was first published in 1980 and has had regular supplements published by the Gale Research Company every year. Central Library's Local History and Genealogy Department holds the print version of these titles, as will other genealogy centers and libraries. And our most recent copy is of the 2023 supplement. This resource is also available digitally through Ancestry.com, although not Ancestry Library Edition. But it is available on the library edition of MyHeritage. So check your local library for access. And the only caveat is that the online version of this resource may not have the most recent supplements available. Now I'm going to take you to a search. I wanted to take you through a search through Philby's. So I begin with an initial online search at Ancestry, but I don't start with a general search. One of the options in the search drop-down menu is for card catalog. And with the card catalog search option, I can enter a full or partial title or search by keyword. In this case, I enter the initial part of the title. There are only 5 results, and the first one is for Philby's. Note that under the filters, Ancestry indicates the number of records for each category. In this case, all 5 results are under immigration and emigration. Here's the initial search page for Philby's. Note that while this is one of the databases in immigration and emigration category, which would normally allow for date and month of arrival as well as year, this one only allows you to search for the year and location. But you can add in the birth year and the year for any event that might be related to your passenger. And in my case, I search for one of my brick walls, which is my 2 times great-grandfather, Thomas Patterson. Now, doing this in Ancestry, it would allow me the option to include it directly from my family tree, but I opt to just enter the birth year, the rough arrival date, which is we've had fun with because he entered every date from 1888 to 1891 for his date of entry. And then I do also include 1893 and the location of Michigan, USA, which is when he married my 2 times great-grandmother. There are, as you can see, there are 75 records that show for Thomas Patterson, and it looks for various spellings of Patterson. As long as you don't click to search exact, it will pull up additional versions of the name. And even though the arrival date of 1896 in this first record, it puts it too late for my ancestor to have arrived, it does say it's Michigan, so I decide to take a look. And this is what Philby's shows, is that the arrival year was 1896, the place was Michigan, the name was only Thomas Patterson, and this is the key information here is the source bibliography. This is where Philby's pulled the information from. And we see it says Index to Naturalization Records for St. Clair County from 1854. And it says it's in Blue Water Family Backgrounds. So then I need to look and see if if Ancestry has this information. The easiest way to tell is that they have this blank index card instead of an image. So that means to me that that Ancestry does not yet have a digitized version of this resource. So then I go to my next favorite place to search, which is FamilySearch.org, which yes is run by the Mormons, but they have they've been working on digitizing a lot of records, including those of their partners. And I should full disclosure, the Onondaga County Public Libraries is an affiliate library of the Family Search libraries in Utah. So what I do is I go to catalog, and then going to catalog, remember that I'm looking for the Blue Water family backgrounds. Rather than put in the title, I decide to type it in under keyword search in the hopes that it'll pull up any of their digitized records. And even though I'm hoping for digitized records, I still do the availability as any, because I'm really curious to see where it's located. And lo and behold, here's a hit for Blue Water family backgrounds, the St. Clair County Family History Group, Port Huron, Michigan. And there are 50 records, but I am particularly looking for a specific volume. And so I click on this first record in the hopes that it'll include more than just the individual volumes listed below. I see under notes that it's a quarterly publication, that it is indexed in Percy, which is held at the Allen County Public Library Genealogy Center. And I see that I can see on this resulting page that Family Search does not yet have this source digitized, but I do see that I can view this catalog record in WorldCat for other possible copy locations. And the great thing with that is, if it's owned by the Onondaga County Public Libraries in any of our branches, I will see that as a result when I click on the link. And the good thing with clicking on the link directly from Family Search, it will pre-populate your search in WorldCat. So I can see here that it is not owned by Onondaga County Public Libraries, which I'll be honest, I kind of figured. We're in the Northeast, not in the Midwest, and this is a title for Michigan. So, but I do see that I have access options here. And it looks like the closest library to me is the Library of Michigan. Now, if you're in a different location than me, it'll pop up and show you the location that's the closest to you. So since I'm really curious to see what this record holds, I opt to go to View Access Options. And it shows me that I have one option, which is to request the item through interlibrary loan. And the good thing with that is it says get it from Onondaga County Public Library. Now, I'll let you know the reason it showed that is because I was doing this search at work. So of course the computer recognized the fact I was actually in an OCPL building. This is the resulting page you'll see when you go to do an interlibrary loan request. Now you'll note that because this is a journal title, that the service being offered is to copy an article. So what I do is I have taken under comments, I've taken the information that I found on ancestry.com and typed it into the comments so that they know I'm only looking for pages 11 to 16 of volume 25, number 3 of the Blue Water Family Backgrounds title. And so there's some additional information that I fill out, including my library card number. But let's see here. So once I've entered all my information, I'm able to click submit. And interlibrary loans, you should know, can take up to 6 weeks to arrive, especially when few libraries hold the title. Now all I can do is wait for the record to arrive. And in the meantime, I have plenty of more genealogical research I can do and plenty of other records I can access to do so. I do want to keep sharing that. So. There we go. Okay. So there we are. I hope you've been able